Is this some kind of joke? The question, slick with the casual disdain of youth, sliced through the reverent silence of the grand lobby. It was directed at the old man, a figure who seemed composed less of flesh and blood and more of time itself. His form a gnarled oak amidst the sterile marble and steel of the National Archives for Special Operations History. The young security agent, whose name tag read Jake, leaned forward over his polished chrome console, a sneer playing on his lips. He held the identification card between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead insect. Because if it is, Pops, it's not funny. This is a secure federal facility, not a bingo hall. The old man, Silas, said nothing. His eyes, the color of a winter sky that has seen too many dawns, held a placid depth that seemed to absorb the young man's contempt without ripple or reflection. He stood with a stillness that was not frail but rooted, his hands clasped loosely over the head of a simple wooden cane. His clothes were clean but worn, a tweed jacket that had lost its shape to the memory of his shoulders, and simple slacks, relics from an era when things were made to last. Jake flicked the card. It was a flimsy, laminated piece of cardstock, yellowed at the edges, the photograph a ghostly black and white image of a young man with eyes that burned with a fire now banked to embers. Project Chimera, Jake read aloud, his voice dripping with theatrical mockery. Department of Defense. Seriously? The lamination is peeling, the typeface is something out of a gangster movie, and there's no magnetic strip, no chip, no biometric data. My nephew could make a better fake in his high school art class. A small line of people waiting for clearance shuffled their feet, a collective rustle of discomfort. They were academics, historians, a few junior military officers in crisp uniforms, all of them now unwilling spectators to this small, ugly theater of power. They watched the arrogant youth, puffed up with the minor authority of his uniform and his scanner that beeped with predictable importance, confront the old man whose silence was becoming a presence in itself, a force as palpable as the cold, conditioned air. Silas's voice, when it finally came, was like the slow turning of a heavy page. It is not a fake. The words were simple, direct, offered not in defense, but as a statement of fact, as one might comment on the weather. This utter lack of reactivity seemed to infuriate Jake more than any argument could have. It was a denial of his power, a refusal to even acknowledge the stage he had constructed. Oh, it's not a fake. Jake shot back, his voice rising in pitch. My mistake. I guess the entire federal identification system, all the modern security protocols we have in place, they just forgot to account for this historical artifact. What did you do, Grandpa? Find this in a cereal box in 1950. The agent's sarcasm was a performance for the small audience, a way to assert his dominance over the quiet dignity that so clearly unnerved him. He tossed the card onto the counter. The plastic made a sharp, insignificant clack against the granite, a sound that seemed to echo in the vast, cathedral-like space. The world around Silas faded into a muted hum, the agent's sneering face dissolving like a photograph in water. That sound, that sharp, brittle tap of plastic on a hard surface. It was not granite, but steel. The clack of his new identification, fresh from the laminator, being slid across a cold metal desk in a room without windows, deep beneath the earth. The air had smelled of ozone from the overworked machines and the faint, clean scent of gun oil. A man with a face carved from granite, a full colonel whose name he was never allowed to speak, had pushed the card toward him. You are no longer Samuel Silas Croft, the colonel had said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was meant to be forgotten. You are a ghost. This card is the only thing that says you exist. It will not get you into a movie theater. It will not get you a discount at the PX. It will not be recognized by any police officer, any government agency, or any branch of the military you think you serve. But if the day ever comes when you have no other choice, you present this at a facility like this one. It is not a key to a door, son. It is a bell. And if you ring it, you pray to God someone remembers the sound. The memory was gone as quickly as it came, a flash of lightning illuminating a landscape from a lifetime ago. Silas's eyes refocused on the young agent, who was now leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, basking in what he perceived as his victory. The old man's expression did not change, but a profound weariness settled deeper into his bones, a sorrow for the boy who could not see the bell for what it was and heard only noise. Behind them in the line, Dr. Eris Thorne, the facility's senior civilian archivist, shifted her weight. She was a woman in her late 40s, with an academic stoop and eyes that were trained to see the stories that objects told. She had initially felt a pang of pity for the old man, a familiar frustration at the casual cruelty of bureaucratic gatekeepers. But now, she was studying him with a professional's intensity. It was his posture, not the stoop of age, but the ramrod straightness of his spine, a discipline that time had failed to erode. It was the way his eyes, calm as they were, scanned the room, noting the exits, the security cameras, the placement of the guards, a series of micro-assessments as ingrained and unconscious as breathing. And it was the ID card, which Jake had so contemptuously dismissed. Eris's gaze sharpened. From her angle, she could see the insignia Jake had mocked, a strange, stylized chimera, its 3 heads, lion, goat, and serpent, entwined around a single skeleton key. It was not a symbol she recognized from any official military crest or unit patch. It was something else, something clandestine, something that tickled a remote corner of her memory, a reference in a file so heavily redacted it was more black ink than text, a file she had only been allowed to see for a moment before it was sealed again under a 75-year classification. The file had been about asset denial operations during the iciest depths of the Cold War. Ghost units, men who were sent into places that didn't officially exist, to fight wars that were never declared, their lives and deaths erased from the official record before they even happened. Jake, meanwhile, was warming to his theme, his voice echoing with self-satisfaction. Look, old-timer, I'm trying to be nice here. You're clearly confused. Why don't you just turn around, go home, have a nice cup of tea, and take a nap? I won't even file a report. We can just pretend this little field trip of yours never happened. How does that sound? His tone was a thick, condescending syrup, the kind one uses for a difficult child or a pet. But Silas did not move. He seemed a statue carved from the bedrock of some unshakable conviction. His gaze remained fixed on Jake, not with anger, but with a quiet, unnerving patience, as if he were waiting for the boy to finish his tantrum. The silence stretched, thin and tight. Jake's smile finally faltered, the easy confidence in his eyes curdling into genuine irritation. This wasn't following the script. The old man was supposed to get flustered, angry, or apologetic. He was supposed to crumble. This quiet defiance was insubordination. Fine. Jake snapped, his voice losing its playful edge and taking on a harder, colder tone. You want to do this the hard way? You got it. He reached for his radio, his movements now sharp and aggressive. Dispatch, this is Agent Miller at Northgate. I have a situation. An unidentified elderly male attempting to gain access with a forged Class 1 identification document. He is non-compliant. I need a security team to my position for escort. And, he added with a flourish of spite. Better call the city police as well. We'll need to book him for trespassing and forgery of a federal document. The crowd murmured, the discomfort now hardening into a low thrum of disapproval. To see a man of such advanced age treated with such callous disrespect struck a dissonant chord. Yet, no one intervened. The sanctity of the uniform, the sterile authority of the security checkpoint, held them in place. Silas simply inclined his head, a gesture of almost regal acceptance. It was as if he had expected this, as if this were just one more river to cross, one more meaningless obstacle in a life defined by them. He had faced down men with knives in darkened alleys, stared into the barrels of rifles across snowy fields, and listened to the tick of a clock that was counting down to 0. The bluster of an arrogant boy was less than a whisper in a storm. He was ringing the bell. He could only hope that after all these years, someone, somewhere, still remembered the sound. The air in the lobby was thick with a cloying tension, a mixture of embarrassment and morbid curiosity. The other visitors in line kept their heads down, their gazes averted, as if the scene were a car crash from which they could not look away. Jake Miller, the young security agent, stood with his chest puffed out, a petty tyrant savoring his small kingdom of granite and glass. He had made the call, and now he waited for the cavalry, for the reinforcement that would validate his authority and sweep this silent, stubborn old man out of his sight. He picked up Silas's ID card again, turning it over and over, the very picture of condescending scrutiny. You know, the craftsmanship is almost impressive for a forgery of this vintage, he mused, loud enough for everyone to hear. I mean, the dedication it must have taken to get the font just right. Did you have a little printing press in your basement, Grandpa? Running off fake IDs for you and your buddies to sneak into the VFW hall. Silas's eyes were distant, his focus turned inward. The agent's words were a meaningless drone, the buzzing of a fly in a room where history held its breath. The quiet dignity of the old man was a stark contrast to the agent's frantic performance. Jake was a whirlwind of nervous energy, tapping his fingers on the console, adjusting his tie, glancing at the entrance, eager for the arrival that would cement his victory. Dr. Eris Thorne, however, watched the scene with a growing sense of dread that was quickly solidifying into professional alarm. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument for historical detail and pattern recognition, was working furiously. The Chimera and the Key. Project Chimera. The name itself was a whisper from the deepest, darkest vaults of Cold War history. It was not a project that officially existed. Any mention of it was a ghost in the machine, a fragment of a rumor buried in layers of deliberate obfuscation. She knew that the official story was that it was a disinformation campaign, a phantom created to mislead Soviet intelligence. But there were whispers, legends among the archivist community, of something more. A unit so secret its members were scrubbed from all records, their service files burned, their very existence denied by the nation they served. They were the scalpel used for the cancers the government could not admit it had. And the symbol, the chimera entwined with a key, was said to be their mark, seen only once on a single, carbon-copied document before it was incinerated. Her heart began to beat a little faster. If that card was real, then the man standing before them was not just a veteran. He was a living ghost, a primary source from a chapter of history that was never written. Jake's next words jolted her from her thoughts. So what's the story, Pops? Were you some kind of super spy? James Bond's older, less successful brother? He sneered. Come on, humor me while we wait. What was Project Chimera? A secret mission to liberate a schnitzel factory in Austria. The insult, so juvenile and jarring, was the final catalyst. This was not just an act of disrespect. It was a potential desecration of history. Jake, in his profound and aggressive ignorance, was like a child playing with a live grenade, utterly unaware of the power contained within the object he was mocking. Eris made a decision. With a quiet apology, she stepped out of the line, her movements discreet and purposeful. She walked away from the unfolding drama, her sensible shoes making no sound on the polished marble. She did not head for the main archives, but for a small, soundproofed office tucked away behind the public exhibits, a sanctum of research and quiet contemplation. Her colleagues would assume she had grown tired of the wait, but she was moving with an urgency that belied her calm exterior. Inside her office, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and leather-bound books, she bypassed her regular phone. On a small, separate table sat a relic from another era, a heavy, black Bakelite telephone with a rotary dial and a single, ominous red button at its center. This was the Bat phone, as the staff jokingly called it. It was a direct, secure line to the Department of Defense's Historical and Heritage Command at the Pentagon. It was meant for emergencies of the highest archival order, a catastrophic fire, a major security breach, or the sudden, unexpected declassification of a world-altering secret. Using it for a disturbance in the lobby was unthinkable. But Eris's instincts, honed by 20 years of sifting through the lies and legends of official records, were screaming at her. She lifted the heavy receiver. There was no dial tone, only a faint, static hiss, the sound of a direct and open line. She held down the red button for a moment, then spoke, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the frantic energy coursing through her. This is Dr. Eris Thorne, Senior Archivist at the National Archives for Special Operations History. I have a Priority Omega situation at the Northgate Public Entrance. Priority Omega, a code she had learned in her orientation and had never once heard used. It was reserved for events involving assets or information from the deep, black, historical record, matters that were officially non-existent. There was a pause on the other end, a silence so profound it felt as though the very air had been sucked out of the line. Then, a calm, male voice stripped of all inflection. "Doctor, please confirm your authorization code." She recited the string of numbers and letters from memory. Another brief pause as she was authenticated. "State the nature of your situation, doctor." "There is a man here," she said, choosing her words with surgical precision. "An elderly gentleman. He has presented an identification card that our frontline security has dismissed as a forgery. The card bears the name Project Chimera and an insignia of a three-headed chimera and a key." Again, that unnerving silence from the other end of the line. It was longer this time. Eris could almost feel the weight of that name landing in some heavily fortified room miles away. When the voice returned, it had changed. The calm was still there, but it was now stretched taut over a core of pure, high-tensile steel. "Describe the man." "Caucasian male, estimated age late 80s to early 90s. Approximately 5'10". Gray hair, blue eyes. He is carrying a simple wooden cane. His posture is erect. He is preternaturally calm in the face of significant verbal harassment from the security agent." "Describe the card." "Laminated cardstock, yellowed with age. Black and white photo. No electronic features. The insignia is in the top right corner." The voice on the other end spoke, but not to her. She heard a muffled but urgent command. "Get me General Thorne. Now. Scramble the Citadel protocol. I don't care what briefing he's in. Tell him Chimera is at the gate. I repeat, Chimera is at the gate." Then, the voice was back, focused entirely on her. "Dr. Thorne, what is the current status of the asset?" "The asset?" Eris repeated, momentarily confused. "The man, doctor. What is his status?" "He is being detained at the security checkpoint. The agent has called for a local police unit to arrest him." The reply was instantaneous, a command delivered with the force of a physical blow. "Doctor, you will prevent that at all costs. You will not allow local law enforcement to interact with that man. You will not allow him to be removed from the premises. A response team is being dispatched. Their arrival is imminent. Do you understand your instructions?" "Yes, but how am I supposed to?" "Your security agent's name is Jake Miller." The voice interrupted, and Eris was stunned by the speed at which they had pulled the information. "Tell Agent Miller to stand down and await the arrival of a DoD command unit. Tell him that is a direct order from the Pentagon. He is to cease all communication and interaction with the subject immediately. Is that clear?" "Perfectly," Eris said, her own voice now trembling slightly. "Good. We have the internal security feed. We are watching. Do not fail, doctor." The line went dead, the click of the disconnection echoing in the small office. Eris Thorne slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. Her hand was shaking. She had just, in essence, lit a match and thrown it into a powder keg that had been sealed for over half a century. Outside her office door, Jake Miller was about to find out that the bingo hall was closed, and that the quiet old man he was tormenting was about to become the absolute center of his universe. The silence in the lobby had become a character in its own right, a heavy blanket that smothered every cough and rustle of clothing. Jake Miller, having made his grand pronouncement, was now caught in the awkward limbo of waiting for its fulfillment. His bravado began to leak away, replaced by a sullen impatience. The old man, Silas, remained a granite pillar of calm, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the walls of the building, a place in his memory that was far more real than this sterile, brightly lit purgatory. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, in young lieutenants fresh from officer school who thought the world was a textbook problem to be solved with regulations and loud voices. He had seen it in interrogators who believed pain and humiliation were keys that could unlock any door. And he had learned, in the crucible of his long and violent life, that the only response to such a storm was to become a mountain, to let the wind and the rain break against you until the storm exhausted itself. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the air pressure, signaled the return of Dr. Eris Thorne. She walked back towards the security desk not with the hurried gait of an emergency, but with a deliberate, measured pace that commanded attention. Her face was pale, but her expression was one of grim resolve. She walked directly to the chrome console, positioning herself between Jake and Silas, a small but significant act of intervention. "Agent Miller," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. Jake looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, doctor?" Can't you see I'm in the middle of a security situation? You are to stand down, she said, the words clear and precise. You will cease all interaction with this gentleman. You will not speak to him. You will not touch him. You will return his identification card to him. You will then await the arrival of a Department of Defense command unit. Jake stared at her as if she had just started speaking in tongues. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. You have got to be kidding me. Stand down? Who do you think you are? The head librarian? I am the federal agent in charge of this checkpoint. I don't take orders from you. Eris met his gaze without flinching. Her own eyes, usually filled with the mild, intellectual curiosity of a scholar, now held a glint of cold, hard certainty. This is not an order from me, Agent Miller. This is a direct order from the Pentagon, from the Historical and Heritage Command. They have instructed me to tell you that if you do not comply, you will be in violation of Title 18, Section 1001 of the U.S. Code and subject to immediate termination and federal prosecution for obstructing a matter of national security. The legal jargon, delivered with such unerring confidence, hit Jake like a physical slap. The color drained from his face. The easy sneer vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. He looked from the severe face of the archivist to the impassive face of the old man, his mind struggling to connect the two. National security? The Pentagon? For this confused old man and his joke of an ID? This is insane, he stammered, his voice losing all of its earlier bravado. You called the Pentagon? Over this? They're going to laugh you out of a job. Return the card to him, Agent Miller, Eris repeated, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. Now, there was something in her tone, a certainty so absolute that it finally broke through his wall of arrogance. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced his ego. He fumbled for the laminated card, his hands suddenly clumsy. He hesitated, looking at it one last time as if trying to unlock its secret. The peeling lamination, the faded photo, the ridiculous name. It made no sense. But the fear of career-ending consequences was a powerful motivator. He slid the card across the granite counter toward Silas. The old man accepted it with a slight nod, his fingers closing around the small rectangle of his past, and slipped it back into the inside pocket of his tweed jacket. A profound stillness descended once more. Jake was frozen, caught between the humiliation of being overruled and the terrifying possibility that he had made a mistake of monumental proportions. The crowd watched, their silent judgment now palpable. They had witnessed the entire arc, from the agent's cruel mockery to his sudden, shocking neutering. A low rumble began to build from outside, a sound that was less heard and more felt, a vibration that resonated through the soles of their shoes and up their spines. It was the sound of heavy vehicles approaching at a speed far too great for the manicured laneways of the archive complex. The sound grew into a roar, culminating in the sharp squeal of tires on pavement as multiple vehicles came to an abrupt, synchronized halt directly in front of the glass doors of the entrance. Through the tall windows, a stunning tableau unfolded. 3 black, unmarked Chevrolet Suburbans had formed a precise, intimidating cordon around the entrance. Doors flew open and men in dark suits and earpieces emerged, their movements economical and purposeful. They were not soldiers in uniform, but they moved with a disciplined intensity that was far more intimidating. They secured the perimeter in seconds, their eyes scanning every window, every corner, their presence a silent, lethal warning. Then, the door of the central vehicle opened. A figure emerged, and the entire gravitational field of the lobby seemed to warp and bend around him. He was a tall man in his late 60s, ramrod straight in a perfectly tailored Army Class A uniform. For silver stars glittered on each of his shoulder boards, winking in the afternoon light. His chest was a solid block of brightly colored ribbons, a testament to a lifetime of service and conflict. This was General Marcus Thorne, commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, a man who advised presidents and moved armies, a living legend within the armed forces. He did not walk, he advanced. He was flanked by 2 military aides, a Marine colonel and a Navy captain, both of whom looked as if they had been carved from the same granite as their general. They swept through the glass doors, the honor guard moving like a force of nature, their polished shoes striking the marble floor with a sound like cracks of thunder. The air in the lobby crackled with ozone. The handful of junior officers who had been in line instinctively snapped to attention, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. The civilian visitors shrank back, pressing themselves against the walls. Jake Miller looked as if he had seen a ghost. His face was the color of ash, his mouth hanging open, a silent scream trapped in his throat. General Thorne's eyes, the color of storm clouds, swept the room with a gaze that missed nothing. They passed over the terrified agent, the stunned crowd, the resolute archivist, and then they found Silas. And in that instant, the entire universe seemed to stop. The four-star general, a man who commanded the most lethal fighting force in human history, a man before whom senators and kings stood in deference, came to a dead halt. His back straightened, if that were even possible. His hand, crisp in its white glove, rose in a salute so sharp, so precise, it could have cut glass. It was a slow, deliberate movement, filled with a reverence that was breathtaking to behold. He held the salute, his gaze locked on the old man in the worn tweed jacket. And in a voice that was accustomed to commanding legions, a voice that could shake the very foundations of the earth, he spoke, his words echoing in the stunned silence of the great hall. "Commander Croft," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that no one present had ever heard from him. "It is an honor, sir. A profound honor." The world had shrunk to the space between the four-star general and the old man with the cane. General Marcus Thorne held his salute, his arm rigid, a statue of deference carved in dress blues. The two military aides flanking him, a Marine colonel and a Navy captain, mirrored their commander, their own salutes just as sharp, their faces masks of unreadable respect. Silas, who had weathered the storm of Jake's insults with the impassivity of a cliff face, now showed the first flicker of a deep, ancient emotion. A profound sadness ghosted across his features. He slowly raised a hand, not in a return salute. That right had been stripped from him decades ago, but in a simple gesture of acknowledgement. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "At ease, Marcus," he said, his voice a quiet rasp, but it carried across the silent lobby with the weight of a forgotten command. The general slowly lowered his hand. He took 2 steps forward, closing the distance until he stood directly before the old man. The contrast was stark and deeply moving. The towering, decorated general, the embodiment of modern military power, standing at attention before the stooped, civilian figure who seemed to have stepped out of a history book. "I apologize for the reception you received, sir," General Thorne said, his voice low and intense. He did not even glance at Jake Miller, who seemed to be shrinking into himself, trying to melt into the floor. "There is no excuse for this. No excuse at all. The boy was just doing his job, Marcus," Silas replied, his tone gentle, without a trace of animosity. "The world has changed. The shadows we walked in are ancient history. He is a product of a different time." General Thorne's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time, his gaze fell upon Agent Jake Miller. It was not a look of anger. It was something far worse. It was a look of cold, surgical assessment, the look a geologist might give a specimen of common rock, utterly devoid of interest or emotion, except as an object to be classified and discarded. "You," the general said. The single word was not shouted, but it cracked through the lobby like a rifle shot. Jake flinched as if he had been struck. "What is your name?" "Agent. Agent Miller, sir." "Jake Miller," he stammered, his voice a reedy squeak. "Agent Miller," the general repeated, drawing out the syllables as if tasting something foul. "Agent Miller, do you have any idea who this man is?" Jake could only shake his head, his eyes wide with terror. "No, sir." "Of course you don't," the general said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, conversational tone. "His name isn't in your databases. His records don't exist. According to the country he bled for, the country he sacrificed everything for, he was never born and he never served. Men like you, in your safe, comfortable world, sleep under a blanket of freedom that men like him provided, a blanket woven from sacrifices you couldn't possibly comprehend." The general took a step towards the security console, his presence seeming to suck all the oxygen from the air around Jake. "This man, Agent Miller, is Commander Samuel Silas Croft. He was the founder and first operational commander of a unit that you, in your infinite ignorance, have never heard of. Project Chimera. He tapped the counter with a gloved finger, right where the old ID had lain. Project Chimera was not an administrative department. It was a blade in the dark. It was comprised of men who were legally declared dead before they ever stepped on foreign soil. They were sent to do the impossible, the unspeakable, the necessary. They fought wars that were never recorded, won victories that were never celebrated, and died deaths that were never mourned. The general's voice began to rise, not in volume, but in a terrible, righteous intensity that held every person in the room spellbound. Commander Croft led the first team over the wall in Berlin in '61, not to spy, but to eliminate a nest of Stasi torturers. He was in the jungles of Laos in '68, a place we swore we never were, holding off an entire enemy battalion for 3 days with only 5 men, securing intelligence that prevented a regional war. He was the man they sent into a Soviet nuclear facility in the Urals in '72 to sabotage their plutonium production, an act of such audacious bravery that if he had been caught, it would have started World War III. With each revelation, the crowd let out a collective, soft gasp. This was not history. It was mythology made flesh, standing before them in a worn tweed jacket. The identification card you mocked, the general continued, his voice now ringing with the fire of a sermon. The one you called a joke is one of 7 ever created. It is not an access card. It is a summons. It is a failsafe, a last resort for a man who has no other recourse. When that card is presented, it is meant to trigger a protocol of the highest order. It is meant to be met with honor and immediate assistance, not with the insolent sarcasm of a child playing dress-up. He turned his full attention back to Jake, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. You did not just disrespect a veteran, Agent Miller. You spat on a national treasure. You took a man who has sacrificed more for your liberty than you can possibly imagine, and you tried to humiliate him. You failed to see the giant who stood before you and saw only an old man. There is no greater professional failure. There is no greater moral failure. The general paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the profound silence. Your career in federal service is over. The men in the suits will escort you out. You will hand over your credentials and your sidearm. You will be formally debriefed, and you will sign a national security non-disclosure agreement, so binding that if you so much as whisper this man's name to your own mother, you will spend the rest of your life in a concrete box. Am I understood? Yes, sir, Jake whispered, his entire body trembling. The 2 men in suits, who had been standing silently by the doors, moved forward with an unnerving, fluid grace. They flanked the now broken young man, their presence both a sentence and its execution. They did not touch him, but their proximity was a cage. Without a word, Jake began to remove his badge and his sidearm, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unclip the holster. The public humiliation was absolute, a brutal, theatrical stripping of all the authority he had so carelessly wielded just moments before. The lobby was as quiet as a tomb. The onlookers, who had been frozen in place, now seemed to breathe again, a collective sigh of released tension and cathartic justice. The drama had reached its peak, the villain vanquished, the hero vindicated in a display of overwhelming authority and righteous fury. The 2 silent, dark-suited men flanked Jake Miller, their presence an impassable wall of consequence. He placed his badge, his radio, and his sidearm on the chrome counter with trembling hands, the metallic clatter echoing the earlier, contemptuous tap of Silas's ID. It was a sound of finality, the tolling of a bell for a career that had just imploded. The arrogance and sneering confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a pale, frightened young man, stripped of his uniform's authority, exposed and utterly humiliated before the crowd he had sought to impress. One of the agents nodded curtly, a silent command. Jake, his face ashen and his eyes fixed on the floor, turned and allowed himself to be escorted towards a side exit, his walk a slow, defeated shuffle. He vanished from the lobby, a ghost of his former self, erased as completely as the men from Project Chimera had been erased from the official record. The silence he left behind was heavy with the aftermath of the storm. General Thorne watched him go, his expression unyielding. Then he turned back to Silas, his face softening with a deep and abiding respect. "Sir," he said, his voice returning to a more personal, gentle tone, "my men will escort you wherever you need to go. Anything you require, you have only to ask. But Silas was not looking at the general. His gaze, filled with a weary compassion, had followed the disgraced young agent out of the room. He took a slow step forward, leaning on his cane, and his quiet voice stopped the two agents in their charge just before they reached the door. Wait! The agents paused, turning their heads in perfect synchrony. Jake stopped, but did not turn around, his shoulders slumped in shame. Let the boy go, Silas said, his words directed at the general but meant for the entire room. General Thorne looked at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. Sir, his actions were inexcusable. He failed at every conceivable level. He must be held accountable. He has been, Silas replied, his voice calm and steady. You have stripped him of his pride and his position in front of all these people. You have ensured he will never wear a uniform again. Is that not enough? What more do you need from him? He turned his gaze to the young man's back. Son, he said, his voice gentle. Jake flinched at the word, but he slowly, reluctantly, turned to face the old man he had so grievously misjudged. His eyes were red-rimmed, glistening with unshed tears of humiliation. You made a mistake, Silas said simply. You mistook the vessel for what it contains. You saw a frail old man because that is all you expected to see. It is a common mistake for the young. You see the world as it is presented. You have not yet learned to look for the history that is hidden beneath the surface. He took another slow step forward, closing the distance until he was only a few feet from the trembling young man. Power, real power, is not in a uniform or a badge. It is not in a loud voice or the ability to command others. That is just authority, and it is as fleeting as the morning mist. Real power is in here. Silas gently tapped his own chest with a gnarled finger. It is in knowing who you are, what you have done, and why you have done it. It is in the burdens you have carried and the silence you have kept. It is a weight that you carry alone. Jake could not meet his eyes. He stared at the floor, a choked sob escaping his lips. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words barely audible. I am so sorry. Silas reached out a hand, not to strike or to menace, but placed it gently on the young man's shoulder. The touch was surprisingly firm, the hand of a man who had known a lifetime of hard work and harder things. You have a long life ahead of you, Silas said. Do not let this moment of shame define it. Let it be a lesson. A painful one, yes, but a valuable one. Learn from it. Learn to see people. Not their age, not their clothes, not their station. See their story. Everyone has one. Most are just quieter than yours. He gave the shoulder a gentle squeeze and then released it. He looked at General Thorne. Let him go, Marcus. Let him go home and think about what he has learned today. That will be a greater punishment and a greater teacher than any official reprimand. The general stood for a long moment, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. His military mind demanded accountability, discipline, and consequence. But the man he revered above all others was asking for grace. He finally gave a slow, reluctant nod to his men. Release him, he commanded. The two agents stepped back from Jake, their duty fulfilled. The young man stood alone, utterly adrift. He looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a new and profound understanding, a dawning horror at the magnitude of his error, and an overwhelming gratitude for the mercy he did not deserve. He wanted to say more, to express the roiling chaos of his shame and relief, but the words would not come. He simply nodded, a jerky, pathetic movement, and then turned and fled through the door, a man running from his own reflection. Silas watched him go, a deep sigh escaping his lips. The moral lesson had been delivered, not with a thunderous sermon, but with a quiet act of forgiveness, an act that seemed to resonate more deeply in the silent lobby than all the general's righteous fury. It was a final, unexpected twist in a day full of them, a testament to the fact that the truest strength of a hero is not in his capacity for war, but in his capacity for grace. The grand lobby of the archives began to return to a semblance of normality, though the emotional residue of the confrontation lingered in the air like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. The onlookers, who had been a captive audience to the raw drama, began to disperse, speaking in hushed, reverent tones, their cell phones held loosely in their hands as they tried to process the living history they had just witnessed. They would tell this story for years to come, a modern parable of hidden heroes and the folly of youthful arrogance. General Thorne dismissed his aides with a curt nod, and they took up positions by the main entrance, their formidable presence ensuring that no further disturbances would occur. He then turned his full attention back to Silas, his demeanor shifting from that of a four-star general to something more akin to a devoted student addressing a revered master. "Commander," he said, his voice now quiet and filled with a warmth that was reserved for a select few. "It has been too long. We had you listed as, well, we weren't sure. The records are sealed so tight, even I have trouble accessing them." Silas offered a faint, weary smile. "That was the point, Marcus. We were meant to be forgotten. It was the only way to keep the ghosts in their graves." He gestured around the vast, silent hall. "You've built quite a monument here. A temple to secrets. We try to honor those who served in the shadows," the general replied. "Their stories deserve to be preserved, even if they can't be told publicly. Which brings me to my question, sir. After all this time, after 60 years of silence, why now? Why ring the bell today?" Silas's gaze drifted towards the far end of the lobby, where a set of heavily reinforced steel doors marked the entrance to the deep archives, the most secure part of the facility. "There was a man on my team," he began, his voice taking on a distant, storytelling quality. "His name was Elias Vance. We called him Echo. He was our communications expert. He could make a radio out of a roll of wire and a piece of tinfoil. He was the quietest man I ever knew, but he could hear the world turning. We went through hell together. The kind of hell that welds souls." He paused, his eyes unfocused, seeing a time and place no one else in the room could. "Before our last mission, the one in the Urals, we made a pact. We knew the odds were against us. We knew we weren't supposed to come back. We promised each other that if one of us made it out, he would wait. He would wait until the world was safe, until the wall had fallen, until our war was truly over. And then he would come back for the other." The general listened with rapt attention, his own face a study in solemn respect. "After the mission," Silas continued, "we were separated during extraction. I was picked up. He wasn't. The official report, the one that only 3 people ever saw, listed him as killed in action. But I never believed it. Echo was too smart, too resourceful. I always believed he was captured." His hand tightened on the head of his cane. "I've spent my life waiting, watching. I have a small pension, a quiet life. But I never stopped listening for his signal. A few weeks ago, a trove of old KGB files was declassified and quietly released to a university in Germany. An old friend of mine, a historian, was sifting through them. He found a reference, a single line in a heavily censored interrogation transcript. It mentioned an American prisoner, held for over 50 years in a secret gulag north of the Arctic Circle. A man they called Prizrak, the Russian word for ghost or phantom. A man who was an expert in codes and radios. A man who never broke. Elias. The general breathed, the name a prayer. "I believe so," Silas said with a nod. "The file mentioned he had finally passed away last year. And it mentioned that his personal effects, what little there were to be repatriated as a low-level diplomatic gesture. They were sent here, to this archive. They are logged under a miscellaneous acquisitions file. A box of trinkets from an unnamed prisoner of war." He finally looked at the general, the embers in his old eyes glowing with a final, determined heat. "I'm not here to read my own file, Marcus. I am not here for glory or recognition. I'm here to keep a promise. I've come back for my friend. I've come to take Echo home." The general was silent for a long moment, his throat tight with emotion. The quiet dignity, the profound loyalty of the man before him was overwhelming. This was the reason he had put on the uniform in the first place, the ideal of service and brotherhood that this old man embodied. "Of course, Commander," the general said, his voice thick. "Of course, I'll take you to him myself." He offered his arm, not as a general to a subordinate, but as a man offering support to an honored elder. Silas, for the first time, looked his age. The adrenaline of the confrontation and the weight of his confession had taken their toll. He accepted the arm, and together, the two men, the living legend and the keeper of his flame, began the slow walk across the marble floor, heading towards the heavy steel doors, towards a box of trinkets and the final fulfillment of a promise made in the heart of the Cold War. Their footsteps echoed in the great hall, a steady, rhythmic beat, like a drum marking the end of a long, silent vigil. It is a story that reminds us that heroes do not always wear capes or shiny uniforms. Sometimes, they wear old tweed jackets and lean on simple wooden canes. They are the quiet men and women who walk among us, carrying the weight of a history we will never know, their sacrifices hidden beneath a lifetime of silence. They ask for nothing, but they are owed everything. The respect we show to our elders is not just a matter of courtesy. It is a recognition that their wrinkled hands and weary eyes may have shaped the very world we live in. They are the guardians of stories we need to hear, lessons we need to learn. So the next time you encounter one, look closer. Look past the vessel and see the story it contains. If you were moved by this story of honor, sacrifice, and quiet heroism, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational content that honors the forgotten heroes and the timeless virtues they represent. Thank you for watching, and may we all learn to see the giants who walk among us.